We had the opportunity to actually fly down to Florida twice. The first time we flew down, we actually strapped in, and I ended up spending about 5 hours on my back, and the weather didn't allow us to launch. And then we had a problem with one of the main engine control electronic boxes. So we got to fly back to Houston, got 1 day off, then we redid some simulators, make sure we're right up to speed, and came back for another launch. You can see Dom suiting up. Dom's a Navy test pilot, captain selectee, and as I said, he's on his second mission. There's Gerhard, our backup spacewalker. We didn't have to do one, but we were prepared to do one for normal orbiter problems or any payload problems. And Janet in her spacewalking suit, or EVA suit, again through some of our training, she was next with Dom. You can see on launch date, Janet was really excited and all set to go. As well, Janice. Here's Janice also in our dress rehearsal that we do a couple of weeks before launch. We actually get to drive an armored personnel carrier that, in case we had any kind of problems there at the Cape, we'd get away. There's Mamoru giving us the OK sign, and he's ready for his second mission. Really looking forward to it. We go ahead and walk out down the ramp, and this is the time we actually go launch. It was just an outstanding day. We were all set and ready to go. Down there in the bottom corner in the white suit, we've got astronaut John Harrington along with Carlos Gillis, who helped strap us in. We're out there on the pad, and everything is go. We just had the slight delays that you heard when given the awards. Then they said go ahead and launch. Of course, we light up the main engine 6 seconds prior to launch, and that's because we want to check the thousands of parameters. If anything's wrong, we can shut those down. We get the rock that we can definitely feel, and then there come the solids. And I know a lot of you have heard this before, but when the solids light, you really know that something significant in your life has happened. You're just not sure if it's good or not. It was a gorgeous day from inside the cockpit. We do the roll the heads down, and we're on a 57-degree inclination, so going up the coast. Here's another view from the inside. Slight little rumble when the main engines start, and then here we go, bang, there goes those solids. And of course, Janice is in the back. Looks a little washed out here, but she's got this big old grin because she knows that we're on our way, and we're going to get ready to do something that we've been training for over a year. It takes us 2 minutes to get rid of the solids. You can see the big trail that's led by it. After 2 minutes, 2 big cannon shots as we jettison the solid rocket motors. They will burn out. The nose cone has parachutes in them, and they will be recovered off the coast of Florida about 50 miles out. And then it takes us another 6.5 minutes once we get rid of the solids to just go ahead and burn the remainder of fuel in the external tank. We want to get to orbital velocity, which is 5 miles a second or 17,500 miles an hour. And once we jettison the external tank, which goes into either the Pacific or the Indian Ocean, we're ready to get to work.
The first thing we have to do after we get into orbit is open the payload bay doors. This shiny surface is a radiator that lets us get rid of waste heat. We need to get that open within a few hours of arriving in orbit, or we'd have to come back home because we generate so much waste heat. We also have a radar that allows us to send the payload data down at 45 megabits per second, and we can get that deployed. Now we're ready for payload operations. You see Janet and Gerhard here turning on the payload systems, and the next major event is getting the mast out. You can see the tip plate here starting out and the mast coming with it. The mast is going to be 200 feet long when fully extended, the largest rigid structure ever in space up to this time, and it all folds down into a 6-foot package. So it's a very clever mechanical design that allows that all to happen so smoothly, and you see how well it comes out here. This is the X-band panels and the C-band panels on the outboard antenna that will be at the end of the 200-foot mast. You see a graphic here showing that process. Here's the outboard antenna that's going to have to be flipped over to do mapping. And you can see how impressive that total structure is. The mast triples the moment of inertia of the shuttle when it's hanging that far outboard. After we get the whole 200 feet out, the base plate locks in place, and we now have a rigid structure that allows us to do the mapping as required. You see the view out the commander's window of the mast with the antenna in place and ready to start the next activity, which is flipping that antenna over so the receiving face will point at the Earth. Then we can maneuver it to the 45-degree angle to the horizon that's required for mapping. As Janet mentioned, the main beam in the bay is a radiator, and both the outboard and the center receive the signal. The X-band can actually track trees. The C-band has a longer wavelength than just does land. This shows you how the map was produced. Because the Earth turns underneath the shuttle as it rotates, the subsequent paths are 23 degrees apart. So it was a very challenging task for the folks that got the award earlier this evening to make sure that each one of those next paths lined right up to the one that was done earlier. Once we get all that set up, the major crew activity is to change tapes. We had to change 330 tapes in the course of our 9-day mapping mission. That's about a tape every half hour, and you see Mamoru and me doing one of the many tape changes that we had to do.
One of the maneuvers that we had to do that were was special on this flight was a fly cast maneuver, and well into the flight, after we had gotten comfortable with that, we pulled out the fishing hats and fishing poles and set up some props to do that. But this fly cast maneuver is a very special maneuver that uses specially designed procedures and accurately timed pulses of the jets to make sure that the mast doesn't exceed its limitations. If you look on the far right side, you can see that the mast is really moving here. There's no subsequent oscillations and movements, and that's because of those specially and carefully timed pulses keep it from doing that. And maybe we'll have time later to tell you about that flycast maneuver, but here it was working just flawlessly. Every single time we did it, it moved back and stopped just like we had hoped for.
Since we were taking data 24 hours a day, we were a two-shift mission. 3 people were working while 3 people were either eating or sleeping or exercising. This is the blue shift during one of their meals, getting ready for the evening. This is Dom doing another tape change, Dom and Janice on the blue shift. We had to, as everybody said, over 300 times we had to do this, so we'll show you later on a little creativity that this generated. At the beginning of the red shift morning, this is where we slept. This is me and Gerhard getting out of our sleep bunks that are aligned on the wall. Of course, in space, it doesn't matter which orientation that you sleep, but we have ourselves sort of tied in here in these sleeping bunks on the wall. Of course, after we get up in the morning, we need to take care of some things, some hygiene. Here's me washing my hair. Gerhard is having some breakfast while he exercises on the bike. Dom gets off his shift and gets back on the bike and prepares to go to bed while the red shift then takes over. Gerhard's here changing another tape, and before we did anything, we always got confirmation from another crew member that we were activating the correct recorder so that we didn't make any mistakes. And here's again just some daily housekeeping chores of changing the bio containers for the CO2 scrubbing.
Astronauts are engaged in a variety of work besides radar data taking. Here, Janice is showing a medical kit. At her left-hand side on the ceiling window, you see an electronic camera for the EarthKam experiment. We use a variety of cameras to take Earth photographs. We would like to show you some of the fantastic views of our planet taken by an HDTV camera. Coming from the direction of the Pacific Ocean, this is South America, Bolivia. Here's beautiful coral and sand of the Bahamas. Although observation underwater is not possible by radar, it is possible by HDTV. This is an interesting feature of the ray chart wind structure seen in Mauritania, Africa. Next is the desert of Saudi Arabia, where you can see many black circles, which are irrigation patterns. Here, an angled view of Mount Fuji and Tokyo Bay. You can see the Tokyo metropolitan area. We flew over Honshu at Ocean Sangland. Just downside of the lake around the center of the picture is Tsukuba, where Tsukuba Space Center is located. This is the southern Russia and the Black Sea. We again passed the coastlines of South America. This time you can see Ecuador and Peru. Now we are flying over the Mediterranean Sea. There's Malta, Sicily, and the toll and the hill of Italy. This is Kamchatka Peninsula, featuring a series of volcanoes.
Well, after we got all the data, it was time to stow the mast. Here we have a beautiful side of the boom, and this was the task of the blue shift with Janice and Dom and Mamoru, and here the mast comes in, and it worked just as the deploy in reverse, but not quite, and you will see it why when it happens. And at that very moment, Janet's and my hopes were soaring very high. Unfortunately, the hopes were only soaring high, but not the reality. Here it stops just 2 inches short. The people on the ground were just up to speed and developed some procedures. Here we see the flight director and the Capcom and MCC, and they worked together with the POC, and the lid closed on us. The POC was celebrating, and there were some tears on orbit. But after a long mission almost came to an end, there was time to have some fun, and you can see the smiling faces also because the mission was at this point in time already such a great success. We knew that all the data had been gathered, and as Kevin said earlier, when you had worked successfully, you got some rewards. We saw Janet with chocolate, and Mamoru demonstrates us a specific zero-G way to eat tortillas. Well, and as you know, in space you can do a lot of things. This is a huge water bubble, and in that we have injected rice cookies and also chrysanthemum. Is that correct, Mamoru? Chrysanthemum. And our brave pilot just sucks it up completely. And you can see he enjoys like someone who survived something that he did not know. And of course, enjoyment also includes some dancing, and please to be sure to include some applause for Ginger afterwards. And Janet mentioned already that we had to introduce some creative ways of tape changes, and this is just one of those, which we refer to as the slam dunk tape change. And then, of course, it was time to come home again, much too early.
It seemed like we had just launched and it was time to come home, and we got into landing day quite aggressively, and we then had to wait an extra orbit because the crosswinds were a little bit high at the Cape, which forced us to come home an hour and a half later, and the sun was a little bit lower, and with that sun angle, that gave the folks on the ground at KSC a couple 100 miles of visibility of the space shuttle as we were approaching. They saw the shuttle probably as early as it's ever been seen, and here we see a picture of the camera looking out the front window as Kevin is now flying us manually smoothly onto centerline, and you can see the symbol overlaying the runway at KSC at runway 33. We intentionally lower the landing gear on the space shuttle at 300 feet, and here we see the landing gear coming down. People on the ground will often wonder why it's coming down so late, but that's the intended time to put it down because the space shuttle doesn't glide very well. But here the gear is coming down, and we see a beautiful picture as Kevin smoothly brings us over the threshold, and it was just a perfect, smooth, flawless landing. You can see nearly a zero rate of descent as the tires spin up as we touch down, and you can see us rolling out on the runway. We were trying to do a test with the crosswind, so we delayed putting the drag chute out until the nose gear touches down, and at that time you can see a charge blow out a drogue chute, which pulls out the main parachute, and the parachute helps us slow down a little bit more than the brakes do, so we limit the use on that. Here you can see Kevin smoothly tracking the center line as we're rolling out, and then at 60 knots we jettison the parachute so that the big lines there don't damage the engine bells. And there the 14th flight for Endeavour and the 97th space shuttle flight in our history is complete.
It took us about a half hour to get out. Our mission is over, but there's years of work for the engineers. Our aim was to try to map the majority of the Earth's surface between 60 degrees north and 60 degrees south. It was done with a lot of folks here at JSC, JPL, and our sponsor was a National Imagery and Mapping Agency.